Welcome to the first official episode of Agile Done Right. I'm Michael Renna, the host of this podcast where we talk about all things Agile. Today, we're excited to have a very special guest, a very longtime friend of mine and former colleague. Heather Wilson is with us today. Heather, welcome, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Mike, for having me. It's a privilege.
That's great. Now, Heather, before we get into today's conversation, which is about high-performing teams, I want to make sure our guests and listeners get a chance to hear about your background. Can you take a minute and take us through and maybe a little bit of our history together and what you've been doing since then?
Absolutely. About 25 years ago, I got into technology by accident. I don't think I'll ever leave. But I started in telecom, so was there for 12 years, really leaning into business operations. Switched into healthcare technology, where I met you. And again, stayed with business operations, product management, PMO, portfolio management, but built a brand for transformation. So moved around McKesson and Change Healthcare, helping organizations transform. A lot of that was safe transformations. And so, over the course of my time in industry of leading business operations transformation, met you, right? And was on a high performing team. So looking forward to talking about that. Currently, I'm at Questa Partners. We're a technology consulting company. I get to spend some time with some really great customers, thinking about strategy and execution and riding this amazing wave called AI. So doing some work there. And high performing teams, man, I love this topic. It is something near and dear to my heart. So looking forward to it.
Well, thanks for being with us. And we could have talked about a million different topics. You and I, we do go way back. In fact, I was trying to figure out how long it had been. I think it's been about 10 years. I know it's been about 10 years since I got my SPC certification, and you were there just before me. So I think you had gotten your SPC certification, and I think I joined the team you were on. And that's when I went and got mine as well. And then we spent years training together and transforming. You mentioned Change Healthcare and McKesson and our own organizations and sister organizations. And so we've spent a lot of time in the Agile space, and we could have talked about just about anything in that space, I think, and had a good time with it. But you're right. We were part of a high-performing team. And so we had decided today that would be a terrific topic for us to talk about. And it's one that I think people don't think about often. And I hope that we can talk about sort of the difference in what a traditional team looks like and what a high-performing team looks like, so people can evaluate, am I in a high-performing team? And if I'm not, how do I help this team become high-performing, right?
That's right.
So let's jump in.
Okay.
And here's the first question I want to pose for us to talk about, which is, what is a high-performing team, right? What would you consider to be a high-performing team? What are the hallmarks of it, right? Mm-hmm. What are we talking about?
Right. I think at the highest level, I would say teams that set objectives and can meet their objectives predictably and sustainably and also continue to evolve. I think that's it, right? And I think that comes in a lot of different flavors and a lot of different ways to measure that. And safe predictability, right? I think that's one way you can measure success. But at the highest levels, are you meeting your objectives and growing together?
I like the word too, the objective, because one of the things that I would certainly call out is the sort of this difference in focus. A lot of teams think about output. They measure output. They measure throughput, right? They measure commodity things. How many items are we producing, right? Where you're talking about objectives. What are we trying to accomplish, right? What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, right? So number one is focus, right? What are some of the other hallmarks you think are of a high performer? When we were on a team together, and we both knew we were on a high performing team, what was unique about that?
Yeah, I remember vividly one day, after a working session where we were all on site and kind of going to dinner and kind of reminiscing over the day. And I thought, wow, we came up with some really great ideas. Whose idea was that anyways? And thinking, oh, you know what? It was nobody's one idea. It was like we were building on top of the idea and collectively coming together and sharing an objective and building an objective, sharing ideas. And I think that's an indicator of high-performing teams. Can you collaborate and work towards something together?
Yeah, I remember. I think I agree 100%. right? Teams that collaborate well, that come in and share their ideas and immediately participate and start to build on those things. They're asking sort of what if we did this, what if we did that, right? So what do you think were some of the environmental variables that helped make that happen?
Mhm. I think that it helped a tremendous amount that we were all chasing towards the same objective, right? We all had the goal of transforming into scaled agile with all of the team members. I think that fortunately, nobody came to the table with an ego, and nobody sucked the air out of the room. We were all empathetic, and cross-functional. I think the diversity from which we came, different walks of life and different areas, I think that helped a tremendous amount to get us to where we're at.
Yeah, and I think that's another good point you bring up was the cross-functional nature. And in this team that we're talking about, and I hope to give some other examples of places where I feel like I've been parts of high performing teams and some where I really haven't been. But in this
Yeah.
particular team, we had some very, very talented people, very strong in their particular discipline. And so we represented lots of different disciplines:
Yeah.
product management, software development, regulatory quality, all these, analytics, right? And everyone being, an expert in their space, we were always willing to step out of our lanes, right? Which is not a bad thing. I think it's actually a good thing, and challenge each other rather than saying, "Hey, you're the expert on this. I'm going to defer to you in that." We brought in perspective from everybody, and where people would say, "Hey, look, I know I'm not in that space, but what about this consideration?"
Mhm.
And that made us stronger. And sometimes the
Yes.
expert said, I hadn't looked at it that way, right? And sometimes the expert said, well, here's why we think that, or I think that. And the person who's not in the space says, okay, now I understand better. And so I'm bought in better,
Yeah.
right?
I think there was a couple folks that were gifts to the team where, they would raise their hand and say, I don't think that's going to work. Or, hey, I didn't quite understand that. Can you explain that again? And so it's kind of counterintuitive to find, somewhat of that naysaying being a blessing, but it was, people that were not afraid to raise the hand and kind of poke and prod at some of the ideas we had. And that made us so much better.
It did. And it created some situations where some folks who may have disagreed were then put in a position where the need existed to be able to support something they may not have necessarily agreed with. And that was to me, another hallmark, which is I don't love where we're going with this, but I'm part of this team and I'm committed to this. And the rest of the team supports this approach. I'm gonna commit to it as well. Right. And I know we'll talk more about the agile elements of this that help manage risk, where we could go after and try things and have some experimentation and use things like leading indicators to say, we had this idea. How quickly can we determine if it's going to play out? And if it's not, let's pivot relentlessly to something else. So there was less, it's much more easier, I think, to get on board when we had that level of experimentation. So that's a little bit of a tease for some of the agile stuff I hope we'll go a little deeper in that helped
Yeah,
enable that team, right?
absolutely.
Now, let's talk about the leadership element of this. Now, and here's why I mention that, because this was a team that was an organizational team. It was based on the hierarchy, right? We all reported to the
Yep.
same leader. And so it was, but there's two different kinds of teams we often think about. We think about the hierarchy, and then we think about the network, right? And the network are the virtual teams, the agile teams, and the agile release trains if you're in SAFe, or the folks, cross-functional folks doing lean portfolio management. Those virtual teams are a little bit easier because you don't have that hierarchical element there. Your boss isn't in the room. Now our boss was in the room in a department team, right?
Mhm.
So the question I have for you is why was that different? And what's the role you think that leader had to play to make that team perform well as a group?
Yeah, good question. And it's something I ask myself every day too, right? As a leader, what do I need to do to make this work? I think that he created a space where, no idea was dumb and people could raise their hand without fear of, you know, hey, you're going to get made fun of, or you're going to be laughed at, or, like we were all in a space where, um, it was okay to ask the questions and just hear out one another's idea. I think that was really, really instrumental. I think the innovative and passionate components of leadership in that space, I think um, we really had dialed down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. How
Now, to
about
be
you?
clear,
I mean, oh, go ahead. Yeah,
well,
yeah, yeah.
I certainly recall being laughed at frequently
Oh,
in that team, but I don't think it was for the ideas. I think we grew to respect each other
that's
and
fair.
enjoy each other and have such a shared sort of this connection around our shared goals and the things we were trying to do. We certainly all enjoyed each other's company and had a lot of fun. And I think you even said, we talked
That's
a
fair.
different day. You said the work never felt like work. It felt like
That's right.
fun. So, that's a great hallmark, right? And our leader
Yeah.
for sure was a servant leader. And he
Yeah.
brought, I think the number one thing that Tim brought to our group was energy, right? And
Hmm.
number one, he wanted to walk in and inspire folks to, really commit and sort of ramp up the energy towards whatever we were trying to accomplish. And
Yeah.
I think that was very unique and appreciative, right?
Yeah.
The other thing about our team, I think it's a hallmark of high performing teams, is we developed a learning culture, right? And we promote that. We
Yes.
promote that in SAFe. We promote that in Agile, with continuous improvement and specific ceremonies like retrospectives that bake that in. But in a team that's built around the hierarchy, a departmental team or a leadership team, that's not necessarily baked in. And we developed a learning culture. And remember, we did this by our book club, right? So we would each bring a book in. We would take turns, and I think we gave each other a month or something to read, because we all had day jobs. And each person would take a turn bringing a book in that they thought was impactful.
Yeah.
And we would then talk about it and learn together from it. And I think that culture was really, really important. In fact, I remember to this day your book. I know exactly which one you brought in 10 years ago, which was Don Reinertson's Principles of Product Development Flow.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
remember for two reasons. One, because this is the book where weighted shortest job first comes from, which is an incredibly impactful prioritization practice that I'm touting all the time. I think it's terrific. It was also a very math oriented book. So I remember traveling on a plane when I was reading that and thinking, Heather, this has got to be the driest book I've ever read.
I, we were on a plane together when you were reading it on a
That's right.
Kindle version, and I was in the row in front of you, and I was like, "What part are you at? What part are you at?" And you did not enjoy the
That
banter
book
back and
was your
forth.
jam. I remember
It
that.
is my jam. I have
Still
a
is.
signed copy. Donald, if you're listening, would love to talk more. Yes, I have a huge passion for that book because
Yeah.
it does explain in detail in a cerebral way a lot of the same principles.
Yeah. It was a great book. It's been a lasting book, and there's a lot of things in it that we still use and will continue to use, like weighted
Yeah,
shortest job first.
yeah,
But
that's
and
right.
there were lots of other good books we brought in. I mean, if there's any, if there's a tip that you could take from this, I hope there's lots of tips you can take from this if you're trying to build a high performing team. That learning culture was great. And I think about some of the other books we did. I think we did, maybe we did Good to Great in that group, and I know we did the Phoenix Project, because
Phoenix Project.
that's always been my jam, right? Um, Tim brought in Peak Performance, right, which was
Yeah.
interesting sort of study on how, one, the limitations that we as humans have for capacity for engaged thought in any given day. So trying to maximize your amount of sort of high efficiency levels during the day, and also recognizing too that, boy, meetings, make sure you take breaks, make breaks part of your culture, otherwise people are going to stop being able to hear and think well and things like that. And the other one from that book I remember too was the idea that all growth, whether it's physical or cognitive, comes from going just beyond what's comfortable, right? Or as close to sort of that breaking point. The farther you travel beyond the comfort level to, where you just obviously, there's a point of failure physically and mentally at some point. But getting into that zone and pushing yourself was where real growth happens. Physically, your body starts to develop muscle if you're pushing it beyond what it's, so it can be prepared next time that happens. The same thing happens cognitively. And that was an interesting book we did as well. I don't know if you remember that one, but so one other one, I think this would be a good segue. One of the ones, the other book that I think we did, and I don't know if sometimes after 10 years, these teams, I don't recall
Blur
exactly.
together.
Yeah, they blur together a little bit, right? It was the five dysfunction of teams. And I've been through that as a participant, and I've done that as a workshop for other groups as well. So there's been a lot of time spent with that one. And I also don't recall if we did that book together, but I want to run through that because I think those 5 dysfunctions of a team are a good segue into asking and hopefully answering the question, how do you prevent some of these things, right? A big part of being high performing is going to be how do you get past, how do you build this environment, get past these common pitfalls, right? So the 5 dysfunctions were this. The first was the inattention to results, avoidance of accountability, lack of commitment, fear of conflict, absence of trust. And thinking of those things, and I think when I think about our high performing team, we did a good job of avoiding those things. What do you think are the things that we had to do that helped us deal with some of those typical dysfunctions?
Yeah, I think it starts, in my opinion, with trust and building trust. And it's trusting, can I trust you with the small things as well as the big things? So like as a leader, like, am I going to review the PowerPoint that they sent me and ask for my feedback on in the time I said it was? It's small, right? Am I going to give feedback in a timely manner after I ask for it? It's a small things like, hey, am I going to show up on time? Building trust with people, and once they start to trust you with the small things, they're going to trust you with the bigger things. And so us building trust and holding on to that, I think also setting expectations and having expectations for roles. And I think our training for roles and setting expectations for the roles, even starting important meetings with rules of engagement and setting expectations for meetings. So setting expectations and holding us accountable for what do we want to accomplish, what are our roles in that, and then just really as leaders leading by example and setting the tone. And I think those were really important things that we did as a team.
Yeah, no, let me read some of those back because I think those are really good, right? So you talked about one, building trust by meeting expectations, right? I think you talked about being places on time, right? That was a little thing you mentioned and when you tell someone you're going to do something, follow through and make sure you do it, right? I think those are great examples of little things. One I would add, I think that's good too, is being able to be vulnerable. And that's not easy, and building a team where everyone feels comfortable being vulnerable or saying, hey, I don't know the answer to that, or hey, maybe I screwed up something. Creating an environment where failure is just a learning experience and not something we need to be, beat ourselves up over. So, but that first time and the first person to step up and say, I'm going to show my vulnerability and I'm going to model this behavior isn't easy, right? So I think that's a good one. Now, conflict is on here, right? So fear of conflict was one of the dysfunctions. How do you handle conflict in a high-performing team?
I think, boy, that's a great question, Mike. I think conflict is inevitable. And if you don't have conflict, then you're not on a high-performing team, I would argue, right? And so knowing your audience, right? I think we talked a little bit about not having ego. And I think if you don't have ego, then you're not incentivized to come in and guns blazing in an incorrect forum and have conflict, right? You understand your audience, hey, do I need to take this offline and have a conversation with somebody? Do I need to take a beat before I come back and talk to somebody? Am I going to wait my turn? Am I listening enough before I raise an opposing view? Am I listening to respond or am I listening to understand? So thinking about some of those things as you walk into conflict.
Yeah, I like that distinction. Am I listening to respond or am I listening to hear? I know you said it a little differently than that, but the other thing you said I thought was interesting was knowing your audience. When I think about this topic, I think about the idea of emotional intelligence, right? EQ as opposed to IQ, right? Many people have probably heard that before. IQ, this sort of traditional intelligence quotient. The newer one was this EQ, right? Emotional quotient. This idea for how well do you sort of know yourself emotionally, and how well can you read and understand and empathize with people around you, so what can sort of understand what they might be thinking and feeling, right? And I think some of the best leaders that I've known had a very high EQ and just absolute tremendous control over their emotions, because we're passionate people, right? We get passionate about stuff. Control over their emotions, always calm thinking, and also understanding the people around them, asking the questions and trying to understand what motivates people. And I think that's really important to dealing with conflict constructively.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Okay. So let me ask this question now. What do you think? So we're talking about all the good things about a high performing team. We're talking about what makes a high performing team and some of the hallmarks of it. What do you think? What are some of the I mean, let's sort of shift that over. Let's flip it over a little bit and talk about teams that maybe are not there yet. What are some of the anti-patterns, or the things that we think can prevent a team from, becoming high performing?
Yeah, I do think that if you sit in a room and it appears that you agree on something, and everybody walks away and gets out of the room, and then like travels on a different path. They're like, whoa, wait a minute, that's not what we agreed to. Or somebody, speaks their mind behind closed doors about, hey, well, I really didn't agree with that. Just the lack of consensus and honoring the consensus that is driven in meetings is a great way to like undermine a team's performance. And happens a lot. I think there's a tendency to not want to raise your hand or have a discussion, or fall in line with a decision that you may not agree to, but you got to act as a collective team and execute as planned.
Yeah, I think that starts from the team leader. I think about how I would draw a contrast between a high performing team and maybe a non-high performing team. I think about my experience in witnessing and participating in team meetings, high performing and one I would consider not high performing, right? Especially when you're talking about organizational teams where your boss is in the room. And this is why I say it starts from the leader. In a high performing team, I remember the boss coming in and ultimately opening the meeting and saying, all right, what are we trying to accomplish? How are we doing? What are the challenges? How do we, basically, simply turning the room and the team loose, right? And in those meetings, if that leader was out, didn't matter. We still meet because
Right.
that leader wasn't necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Let me say it differently. Not that it wasn't necessary, but it wasn't. It didn't stop us from operating as a team, right? They had enabled us to operate as a team, and therefore they didn't have to be in the meeting. We could still and would still feel enabled and empowered, and to continue to advance whatever our objective would be. The reverse of that, I see a lot of times. I see team meetings and departmental meetings where it's essentially the leader holding court, either coming in and spending 50 to 60 to 70% of the meeting talking, sharing information, and sort of promoting themselves and the things they know. Then I don't mean to be derisive about that, but it's sort of feel like I'm gonna tell you things that you need to know, and then I'm going to let you petition me for the things you want me to, the decisions you want me to make, or I'm going to ask you what you're doing, what you're working on, and then we're going to walk out, and that's the end of the meeting.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is clearly no shared objectives as a team. It's each one of the folks in the room are probably managing their department well in whatever way they need to manage their department. So we sort of miss an opportunity with these people in a room to have shared goals at whatever level we're talking about, and be going after something different than just reporting on how our departments are performing, right?
Right.
So real distinction for me, stark contrast in those types of meetings, high performing and maybe not high performing team.
Well, and you talk a little bit about, hey, it starts with the leader. I think high performing teams, I mean, in my opinion, a majority of high performing teams start with excellent leadership. And I'd ask you, like, do you feel like you could be on a high performing team and not have a leader that is strong?
I don't think I have been on a team I would consider high performing without a strong leader because they do set the tone.
I think so too, right? And so, like, it begs the question of if you're not on a high performing team as an individual contributor or maybe a manager on that, can you have influence to make things better or move it into the direction of a high performing team?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So the
Yeah.
question, let me repeat the question because I think it's a good one, which is if you're on a team and you recognize maybe we're not a high performing team and we want to become one, how do you influence that? And especially if you're an individual contributor. You want to share your thoughts first on that? I got some thoughts.
Sure. I think you have to show an example of it. And so leading by example of, maybe being the first one to share a vulnerability or ask a clarifying question that might seem silly. Encourage others to do the same thing. If somebody also asks a question, of being that first person to say, that's a really good question. I had that same thing too. And just trying to lead by example. But it can be lonely and it can be frustrating. But I would say it's an effort worth pursuing and not giving up on because high performing teams are just so darn important.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
great
what are your
example.
thoughts?
Well,
Yeah.
I think back on how, the question is on how does an individual contributor help a team become high performing? And I agree with you. It is about modeling those behaviors. And it sort of reminds me of, and again, we're really talking mostly about organizational teams here with where the boss might be in the room. And it reminds me, I've been a people leader for most of my career. And we used to do performance reviews every year. And we had I think with McKesson, we had a form and these sort of stock questions. And we would rate people on these questions. And two of the questions for many years, I would often put an A. And the two questions were, or the two sort of topics were influence others, and the second was develop talent. So
Mm,
so oftentimes for individual contributors, I would say, well, that's not applicable. They're not necessarily, their job isn't necessary to influence others, and they're not in a position to develop talent. When we started adopting Agile seriously and started building cross-functional, autonomous, self-organized teams, all of that changed. And suddenly you could see, and you did create an environment where the people in the teams were being asked to influence each other, to being
mhm,
asked to participate, to share their feedback, to share their perspective, and if they feel strongly, convince the team. So they were modeling that behavior. And then the environment allowed for them to invest in each other, and they were developing talent. So
mhm.
sort of two areas where a contributor in a team member can model behaviors that really help promote that team towards becoming really high performing.
Yeah. I remember actually by accident honestly, stumbling into a planning meeting with a team, and the scrum master had the courage to say, "Hey, do you have any questions? Happy to meet with you offline, but really wanted this to be a team thing, and so I'm going to have to ask you to leave as a leader, right?" And so promoting having a role and being an individual contributor, but also shepherding the team, wanting to support the team and having the courage to then influence leaders. I mean, that's power. That's magic.
Yeah, and
Powerful, I guess.
that's a good situation though you bring up because I see that in transformation. I know you probably do too. As we build agile teams and these virtual teams and these network of cross-functional people focused around a specific deliverable or product or service, the role of the manager often changes, right? Or the department, the development director or the quality director, these folks who maybe have traditionally been part of a organization where they were doing a lot of directing, they were doing a lot of maybe task management and things like that, and we're trying to build autonomous, self-organizing teams that don't need someone to tell them specifically what to do, because product management and backlogs and all of that practice that we do will tell them what the most important thing to do is, and they'll figure out the best way to deliver on whatever the objective is. So it changes the role of the manager, where now if I'm in charge of a development organization or a quality department or things like that, my focus is, how do I help enable all of the people in my care, all maybe the people that report through me in some way in my care, who are out in their respective virtual teams. So now my team, the people that report organizationally, I have to look at that very differently. And it is some things like, one, not going to their meetings so that they can develop their skills and their autonomy and be able to decentralize some of those decisions. And it can also change the focus, saying, what do my folks need? The folks that report to me, what do they need? What can I provide them to give them the tools, the skills, the competency, the confidence to go out into these teams and be productive? And that's hard oftentimes to do, because it's a very big shift. That's the servant leadership shift, right? It's a very hard shift for many people to make.
Yeah. And it could be uncomfortable. It can be an unknown. I totally see that quite a bit. I mean, I think that is probably one of the bigger things that get in the way of a transformation of those managers kind of resisting a little bit, because they don't know what that looks like. It's something so different to them. So making that shift is big. It's really important, and it pays off in spades, but it can be very difficult.
Yeah, and it's probably top 5 struggles I think I've seen repeating in different organizations and different transformations, because change is scary, right? And people are, where do I fit in this new model? And getting them over that fear and teaching them a different way to lead is difficult, right?
Yeah.
So and it'd be remiss if I didn't mention why that's so important, I think, to have expert help when if you are in a position where you're trying to build high performing teams and or adopt or readopt or reform your practices, agile practices or lean practices or otherwise. So we're getting close to time here, I think. Let me ask this question, and I think we've talked about a lot of good stuff so far, but as far as takeaways, right? If we had to pick 3 actionable insights for listeners, right? 3 sort of takeaways, and I'll ask this in 2 different parts, right? The first would be, what would we encourage folks that are listening that are leaders of teams that want to build the environment for a high performing team? What 3 actionable insights would you encourage them to take from this? And I'm going to ask the question again in a minute on sort of team members, right? So leaders.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Leaders, set the tone. Right.
Set the tone.
Set the tone, right? You're there to make sure that there's an environment where people can collaborate, ask questions, are held accountable, work together, to lead by example, build trust, do what you say you're going to do, say what you mean what you say. And 3, really promote a place where you can grow together, have the book clubs, have Slack channels that say, hey, here's what I'm reading, talk about what you're learning, inspire others to do the same thing, and really be aware. This is the 4th bonus one, is be aware, have empathy, continue to work on that, right? Don't give up on creating that space.
That's a great point. So how about team members, right? We spent a little time talking about those. What do you think? 3 actionable insights for team members who want their team to grow and develop into a high performing team.
Yeah. And I'll reiterate, this is harder, right? This is harder to lead by influence and be a team member in an environment having to lead that way. Just model the behavior, in those little ways where you can, in meetings, in emails, in communications. 2 is don't give up. Don't give up on influencing to become a high performing team. And the 3rd is continuously improve yourself, grow and learn and do those things that read books, stay inquisitive, and grow your practice.
Yeah, terrific. Well, listen, Heather, thank you for the time and for being with us. Again, we could continue for an hour, I'm sure, on this topic alone. but we want to keep these somewhat short, hopefully, and consumable for the folks that listen. Um, the In our next episode, we're still working on our next episode, but our next episode, let me tease that a little bit. We're going to really talk about about change, and what does it take to make real change happen? What are some of the reasons why change fails? So I know that that's one that hopefully, of course, you would have a lot to say on that as well. So looking forward to making that one. And look, I'd like to have you back. So let's pick another topic sometime soon if you don't mind, and we'll do another one. We'll talk about some of these other things that we've seen over the many years together.
I would love to. Yes. Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Great. Thanks, Heather.